Thanks for coming, and thank you, Tracy. Tracy was here back in March, and it was back when they were having all kinds of flight problems. We were glad that you made it back safely, but she had to leave early, so we weren't able to have this back and forth session, and so we're so glad that you came back. Thank you. I'm going to say a few words. Tracy started her life as a little girl in Birmingham, Alabama. But fast forward, the first part of her professional career was as a nurse, and cardiac nurse, taking care of people's hearts. And after her call to the ministry, she's still taking care of people's hearts, and challenging us in our hearts, and also challenging us to look deep within our hearts. This summer, she was able to go to Ghana in Africa and participate in the 1619 project, which was an acknowledgement of 400 years of slavery. And when the first slave ships came to this country, at least the first recorded slave ship landed in Virginia. That was, I think, pretty amazing experience, and she has much to share with us, not only about that, but from all of her travels. We're so fortunate to have her here. She speaks in so many places. This is one stop, and she's off tomorrow to her next stop, and then a stop after that. So we're so glad to have you here, Tracy, and I'm going to turn it over to you now. Thank you.
I don't want to go up there tonight. Will that work? Yeah, our music's there. Good evening, everyone. It is my honor and my privilege to come back here. I apologize for the way I had to run off before, and I made a promise then. I am way taller than that, Mike. Thanks. Sorry. I made a promise that I would come back, and you were gracious enough to allow me to do so. And my only regret is that I'm back at night, so I don't get that fabulous quiche next door that I had before. What shall we say about these things? It's interesting to come here, having gone to Ghana. I spent 17 days there in the year of return. This is 2019. In 1619, the first documented enslaved Africans arrived on the shores of Jamestown. And this entire year has been dedicated, at least on the African continent, to a year of return, inviting people of African descent to come back to the motherland, to come back home. And it was indeed an experience that I will share with you about later during question and answers if you want to know. But I've spent a lot of time as your Associate General Minister of Justice and Witness, thinking about what it means that this year is that year that marks the beginning of chattel slavery in this country, and recognizing that as we close that year, we enter 2020. Which, yes, is an election year, and yes, that is huge. But it's also the year that marks the 400th anniversary of the Mayflower. We are sitting at the intersection of what historically for the United States will be pain and pride. And how do we live at that intersection together? For everyone has their own experiences, their own stories, their own recollections of what this time period means. And as a denomination who is working towards racial justice, working towards diverse representation in our denomination, working towards creating a safe space and a sacred space to hold all of these stories together, how might we begin that journey? How might we begin that journey in an age of globalization where we're not where we were 400 years ago, we're not where we were 300 years ago, we're not even where we were 50 years ago, where the world has gotten much smaller because we can talk to one another across the waters, across the land, and feel as though we know what's going on everywhere. So I thought I would talk a little bit about that. I don't have a title, but I want to share some thoughts with you and then have some dialogue with you about it. During my last visit to the Vatican, I was speaking with Cardinal Turkson. Cardinal Turkson is the one who penned the encyclical on climate for the Pope. And he quoted Pope Benedict's observance of the impact of globalization in the world during our conversation. What he said from Pope Benedict was that globalization has brought us together, has shortened distances, but it has not quite caused us to become brothers and sisters. I agree with this assessment, and I would like to make note of at least two other consequences of globalization. Globalization has revealed the idolatrous effects of white supremacy throughout the world and has exposed the global impact of anti-Black and brown racism and the marginalization of the poor throughout the world. Globalization also provides, for those of us who fight against such evils, reminders that we are not alone, and a caution that neither are the forces we fight against. After the killing of Michael Brown Jr. in Ferguson by a local law enforcement officer, some of the things you didn't see in the news, no matter how you feel about that story, that were relevant in that moment, is that it was young Palestinian protesters who were living under occupation in the Middle East and watching live streams of the military occupation in Ferguson, Missouri, who tweeted Ferguson youth to let them know what tactics they could expect from our law enforcement officers. Our law enforcement officers who were now in our neighborhood streets with tanks and high assault weapons, snipers on the roof. The shrinking of the world made it possible for Palestinian youth who recognized the tactics that Ferguson officers were using because there's a relationship between the military in Israel and law enforcement in the United States, that many of our law enforcement agencies are traveling to Israel to learn how to fight against terrorism, not expecting that the terrorism would be in our neighborhoods and in our communities. So when they were watching the live stream of how police officers were acting in Ferguson, they recognized the hand signals, they recognized the tactics that were coming, and they were the ones who began sending messages to protesters in Ferguson. The next thing that's going to happen is that there will be tear gas. The next thing that will happen is that there will be rubber bullets. Please make sure that you take your contacts out, because when they spray the gas, the contacts will burn your eyes. Please begin purchasing these things from Walgreens or Walmart. They didn't say those names, but drugstores. These things, because they will be scarce for you to get, and you will need them to make sure that the chemicals on your skin can be washed away. You'll need gas masks, and there won't be enough of them. So begin buying these materials, and this is how you make gas masks. The shrinking of the world through globalization made this communication and these connections possible. Globalization did not make us brothers and sisters, but it has provided better opportunity for the collaboration of allies, the rewriting, and not W-R-I-T-I-N-G, but R-I-G-H-T-I-N-G, the rewriting of history, and the collective prophetic proclamation toward a just world by our communities of faith globally. And where is the church in such work? Beyond the necessary charitable programs and efforts to sustain those who are most vulnerable among us, beyond the necessary feeding ministries and clothing ministries and evangelistic efforts, where is the church in the work of dismantling the systems that perpetuate injustice? I have a sermon that I often preach nowadays, the sermon of the Good Samaritan. Anybody know that story? Every church knows that story. But when I preached that sermon recently, I choose not to focus on the Levite. I choose not to focus on the priest. I choose not to even focus on the Samaritan or the man who is left begging beaten on the side of the road. But my question is, what about the road? How long are we going to allow Jericho Road to stay in the condition that it is? How long are we going to be satisfied with just picking up the people who are beaten and battered and left for dead on the side of the road and think that we have done the work we're supposed to do and never question why the road is the way it is in the first place? How long is it going to be before we attack and address the systems and the structures that make Jericho roads possible? So I ask of the church, and I ask of you tonight, where are we in our challenge against empire, wherever and however empire shows up? There are those who will say that is too political, and the church should not be political. Indeed, we have heard such phrases even as we gather here to talk about justice. But I disagree. For the very birth of the Christ child was both a holy and a political act. The Jesus story, in its historical context, reveals both human terror and divine grace, both human suffering and supernatural deliverance. It is a story that claims God in flesh as one who was vulnerable, poor, displaced, and subjected to tyrannical powers. The Jesus described in the Bible had more in common with the children of refugees born today than we might be comfortable imagining. Jesus is an Afro-Semitic Palestinian whose family was displaced due to terror and political turmoil. The Church of Jesus the Christ cannot be apolitical. There is no middle of the road on matters of injustice. The church is political, but we need not be partisan. We must speak out against harmful policies and yet leave room for personal and communal redemption. We must dare to speak against current horrors and yet never abandon our present hope. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. in his paper, A Knock at Midnight, said, "The church must be reminded that it is not the master or the servant of the state, but rather the conscience of the state. It must be the guide and the critic of the state and never its tool. If the church does not recapture its prophetic zeal, it will become an irrelevant social club without moral or spiritual authority." In the U.S., one of our current leadership's first acts of 2017 was to freeze refugee admissions, citing security reasons. The U.S. admitted 84,995 refugees in 2016, a total that declined to 53,716 in 2017. And for fiscal year 2018, refugee admissions capped at 45,000, which was the lowest since Congress created the refugee program in 1980 for those fleeing persecution in home countries. In 2019, we capped at 30,000. And the cap for 2020 has been set at 18,000. And to be clear, these changes to immigration policy in the United States are not designed to impact all border crossings, but it disproportionately targets the southern borders. No one is talking about building walls on the Canadian border. It is the southern borders where we are disproportionately targeting those who reach for freedom. Because the southern borders are where those most likely crossing have non-white skin. It matters in immigration in the United States, the color of one's skin. And not only in the United States, but globally as well. We all have our legalistic ways of identifying the haves and the have-nots. Our legalistic ways of identifying who's in and who's out. Therefore, any global crisis involving migrants and refugees must include Palestinian refugees, refugees oppressed in their own land, Syrian refugees, African refugees. Afrophobia, the fear and hatred of people of the continent of Africa, is a real thing. It is as present as Islamophobia. Central American refugees and Haitian refugees and Mexican refugees, LGBTQ refugees, and any other alienated group we see in our global midst must be taken into consideration. Any discussion about the current state of refugee and immigration policies in the U.S. must be inclusive of historical narratives of racism, poverty, and the pilfering of resources on foreign land, human trafficking, and the sexual exploitation of women and children, both in the world and, yes, in the church. We must not promote ourselves as caring deeply about the migrant women and children and remain silently complicit in the devastating sexual exploitation of women and children all over this world. I am reminded of the warning of the prophet Isaiah, who declares in the First Testament, "Woe to those who make unjust laws, to those who issue oppressive decrees, to deprive the poor of their rights, and withhold justice from the oppressed of my people, making widows their prey and robbing the fatherless." The prophet Isaiah does not offer this warning to the professed enemies of God, but rather to those who profess to be God's friends. Any discussion about the current state of global crisis involving migrants and refugees in the U.S. must also include oppressive policies that criminalize the quest of others for a better life and separates children from their parents at borders. Currently in the U.S., we have over 700 children who have been taken from their parents at the border and who are yet to be reunited. In many of these cases, the parents have already been deported. The church must not be silent while injustice speaks out loudly. What we are witnessing, my friends, at our borders with Black and brown families today is not who America has become, but it is who America has always been. And the church must be bold enough in our prophetic witness to separate ourselves from theological interpretations and Christian expressions that do not articulate a God who is concerned about the entire world. In America, the church has been complicit in the promulgation of religious rhetoric that favors some of God's creation over others of God's creation. As a result, much of the language of populist nationalism is cloaked in feigned righteousness. This has always been my nation's response whenever its false god of white supremacy is threatened. Immigration policy in the U.S. is not as much about safety as it is about separatist ideology. The people of faith must not be silent in the face of a God we do not serve. This is our story. This is our story. America snatched indigenous children from their families. We took children from their parents, and we took their land. And we did it in the name of God. America snatched enslaved children from their families for subjugation and control. And we did that in the name of God. America snatched Japanese American children from their families fueled by fabricated fear, and we did that in the name of God. America snatched 250,000 predominantly black and brown children annually from parents who are caged in prison industrial complexes and that contain the poor and exonerate the wealthy, and we do it in the name of God. America cages over 30,000 children in juvenile detention centers where we would rather incarcerate them than educate them, and we do it in the name of God. And let us not forget that America, too, sent back fleeing Jewish refugees, ignoring the imminent threat of their death. We must not forget from whence we have come. We must always remember. I challenge you tonight to remember the stories that you know are true. To remember the stories that we would rather forget. To remember the stories that we would rather gloss over. As I read the signs of the times we face, my friends, I sense the Spirit leading us to hear the words of Deuteronomy 26, beginning with the 5th verse. Then standing there in front of the place of worship, you must pray. My ancestor was a wandering Aramean who went to live in Egypt. There were only a few in his family then, but they became great and powerful, a nation of many people. Of all the descriptors God could have chosen, why did God choose this one? Why was it important for the Israelites to remember that their story began with immigration? Throughout the history of this nation, millions of people have left their homelands and come to America. Over the past 400 years, people have come for many reasons. Some came because of inhumane economic forces. The evil reality of slavery reminds us that not everyone came here voluntarily. Many African people were brutally transported here against their will for the exploitation of their labor without pay. Others came to escape the ravages of war in their native lands. Still others have come in search of freedom from religion, ethnic, gender, and sexual persecution. And some came seeking opportunities to escape poverty and make a better life for themselves and their families. Yet no matter why or how we came to America, any greatness realized within our borders is because we all are here. The words of President Obama ring resoundingly in my heart today. We were strangers once too, he said. And whether our forebears were strangers who crossed the Atlantic or the Pacific or the Rio Grande, we are here only because this country welcomed them in and taught them that to be an American is about something more than what we look like or what our last names are or how we worship. Hebrew scripture reminds us that the Egyptians grew in their disdain for the refugees in their midst. They treated them poorly and subjected them to unfair labor laws. The Egyptian empire unfairly targeted the refugees with propaganda campaigns designed to turn the Egyptian people against others by portraying the Hebrews as evil and a threat. Such narratives are always necessary to move the masses to act inhumanely. It is difficult to consciously oppress people we do not first learn to detest. So God cautioned those preparing to come and offer the first fruits of their bounty to God in worship to always remember, though they became a powerful nation, their ancestor was a homeless Aramean who sought refuge in a foreign land. Because we refuse to remember the truth of our past, my friends, we repeat its evil and act appalled. America must remember the words inscribed on the Statue of Liberty at a time when our dependence on the help and hospitality of other nations was much more palpable. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless tempest-tossed, to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. God is calling us to remember where we've come from in order to become what we've not yet been. A world committed in principle, in proclamation, and in policy to liberty and justice for all. And shall we, the church, what shall we say of these things? The church must tell the truth. We must engage in the deconstruction of a theology of chosenness that would suggest God is a God of favoritism as opposed to a God of favor. We must help people understand the sacred text not as God's book about a holy people, but rather a people's book about a holy God. It is only in the truth that room can be made for everyone. An analysis of our current xenophobic and racist tendencies must be framed within the historical context that make them possible. We must acknowledge the economic drivers that are at play with the commodification of human flesh and the pilfering of natural resources on land stewarded and occupied by the other. We must replace tolerance with truth. We must replace temperance with truth. Yet truth may be painful, but lies are deadly. White supremacy must be clearly named. Our conversations must shift from equality to equity. Repentance is not enough. Repair is necessary. The church must be political for the sake of our communal soul. And we must affirm that God and not the empire has the last word in human history. There is a higher judge than the Supreme Court, a higher law that's not made by man, a moral law by which all people of faith must live, and that law is love. We are people of faith. People of faith must lead with love. We must legislate with love. We must be governed by love. People of faith must fight always for love. For if it is not love, it is not God. Finally, I will close with the words of a poem that has become very close to my heart. The name of the poem is Home, and it is written by a Somali poet by the name of Warsan Shire. No one leaves home unless home is the mouth of a shark. You only run for the border when you see the whole city running as well. Your neighbor's running faster than you. The boy you went to school with who kissed you dizzy behind the old tin factory is now holding a gun bigger than his body. You only leave home when home won't let you stay. No one would leave home unless home chased you. Fire under feet, hot blood in your belly is not something you ever thought about doing, and so when you did, you carried the anthem under your breath, waiting until the airport toilet to tear up the passport and swallow each mouthful of paper, making it clear that you would not be going back. You have to understand, no one puts their children in a boat unless the water is safer than the land. Who would choose to spend days and nights in the stomach of a truck unless the miles traveled meant something more than the journey? No one would choose to crawl under fences, be beaten until your shadow leaves you, raped, then drowned, forced to the bottom of the boat because you are darker, be sold, starved, shot at the border like a sick animal, be pitied, lose your name, lose your family, make a refugee camp a home for a year or 2 or 10, stripped and searched, find prison everywhere, and if you survive and you are greeted on the other side with go home blacks, refugees, dirty immigrants, asylum seekers, sucking our country dry of milk, dark with their hands out, smell strange, savage, look what you've done to their own countries, what will you do to ours? The dirty looks in the street, softer than a limb torn off, the indignity of everyday life, more tender than 14 men who look like your father between your legs. Insults easier to swallow than rubble, than your child's body in pieces. For now, forget about your pride. Your survival is more important. I want to go home, but home is the mouth of a shark. Home is the barrel of the gun, and no one would leave home unless home chased you to the shore, unless home tells you to leave what you could not behind, even if it was human. No one leaves home until home is a damp voice in your ear saying, leave, run now. I don't know what I've become. So God, have mercy on us until this work is done. Thank you. Sure. About that or about anything else. Immigration is a central effort in the United Church of Christ, and it is so for a reason. It is the intersection of racial disparity, economic disparity, globally. It calls into question who we are as human beings. And for the church, it calls into question who we are as disciples of Christ. And so I choose to talk about it. And I have thick skin, so I don't expect everyone to agree with me, and that's okay. I've never been in a church where everyone agrees. And yet there is something amazing that happens when we can talk about the places where we hurt, where we harm, where we need to grow, where we must heal. When we wrestle together, something amazing happens. So it doesn't have to be a question. It can be you adding what you want to add. Or it can be you asking me about something totally different. Yes, sir.
I wanted to ask you a political question, if that's
Sure.
okay. I remember 50 years ago, a man I worked with was going home after work to try to rally the black people in the city of Cambridge to go out and vote that night, election night. Mm-hmm. And because he says it's hard, particularly with the young people, they don't think it'll make any difference either way who gets elected. So now I'm wondering, in terms of when you look at, looking out to 2020, and you've got pretty clear differences in between the two political parties. I mean, one would say, well, yes, the black unemployment rate has never been this low or something like that, or close to it. But it seems like it's a pretty, to me, it seems like it would be a pretty obvious choice. But do you think the black community is critical, I think, for the Democratic Party to win? They came up for Obama. They didn't really support Clinton to the same extent. I'm just wondering what you think, what you're hearing within the black community now as to how they might deal with this next election.
That's a great question. I think all of what you said is true, and even more than what you said is true. That when you are a people, particularly a people who live at the intersection of racism and poverty, that there has been such disenfranchisement that there are those who don't vote. It's true that people didn't come out, black people didn't come out for Hillary like they came out for Barack Obama. It's also true that black people didn't come out for anybody like they came out for Barack Obama, right? I mean, it was Barack Obama, right? But when you look at the numbers, black people who voted still overwhelmingly voted for Hillary Clinton. And actually, the popular vote, Hillary won by 3 million votes, right? So this is a place where we are spending a lot of time and effort to encourage black people to vote. Now, it's not just the encouraging of black people to vote, but it's dealing with the gerrymandering that's going on, the voter suppression that's going on. And in this country, even the census is being used as a tool to frighten people from the system. So you show up at the polling booth and they say, even though you've lived here 20 years, you've been purged from the rolls, right? So we're hoping, but millennials are very disenfranchised with government, period. And that's not just black millennials. They're disenfranchised, and we have to get the vote out. What I say, and what we're saying at the United Church of Christ, I won't claim it all as my own, is, you know, even in the United Church of Christ, we have people that vote for various reasons in different parties. And I've become very conscious of that. I had a man say to me once when I was speaking, he said, it is harder to come out in the United Church of Christ as a Republican than to come out in the world as gay, right? So it's funny, but there's probably some truth to that. And so I want to be very careful that we frame ourselves as voting one's faith. You know, I don't want to do the red and blue thing. I want to say, vote for the people who line up with your faith. That's why we have a campaign that says, our faith, our vote. It is completely inappropriate for me to say who you should vote for or try to sway you that way, but there are principles that we're supposed to be holding in common. And my concern is that we have allowed the rhetoric, what I really say, if I can just say what I always say, is that we've abdicated too much language. And so we've allowed even our religion to be talked about as the religious right and the liberal left. I don't use that terminology because there's nothing right about what I see going on. I don't consider myself a liberal left or progressive. I consider myself a disciple of Jesus Christ. There's nothing left about thinking that everybody who's hungry ought to be able to eat. There's nothing left about thinking that people who are sick ought to get health care. There's nothing left about that. There's nothing left about thinking that in a country where we have more than enough, that everyone should have shelter, that children should get a good education. And yes, the unemployment rate among black people is lower than it's ever been, but unemployment rates only measure whether you have a job. It doesn't measure what you make on the job. The wealth gap is growing. We are diminishing the middle class. And so the question is, what is important to us? And yes, the black vote will be crucial in this election. So will the church vote. So will the church vote. We have people now who used to be friends in church that can't even worship together. I hope you don't have that here, but that's happening. We're so divided. And we're divided over rhetoric. Is there another question?
Well, thanks for coming. I'm Peter Stewart. Nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you. What's your name?
Peter Stewart.
Hi, Peter.
Hi,
Nice to
Tracy.
meet you.
I think that we have to save the earth from ourselves
Yes.
and also ourselves from ourselves. But to me, I would like you to speak a little bit about that because I believe that even it's a win-win situation if you go solar, if you go wind, if you go alternative and not oil, and put everybody to work with solar and wind. It's win-win. You get less cars, more trains, less traffic. So my understanding is that we don't have too long.
Well, as much as I travel, I would say, and you don't even have to travel to see how our seasons are changing. You know, in St. Louis, I haven't been here long enough to know, but our leaves are falling. They should be falling. It's October. But the problem is they're green. Our seasons are screwed up. I go to preach at our churches in Hawaii. I know somebody's got to do it. Don't hate, somebody's got to do it. And the beaches are disappearing. Hotels are having to build barriers because the water is getting closer. We're polluting our water systems. We don't have long. If we don't correct climate in this generation, our children won't be able to do it. And yet, we have leadership that denies where we are. It's a serious problem, folks. It's a serious problem. And we cannot go another election cycle the way we are right now. So I say to people who doubt climate change, and probably nobody in this room doubts climate change. I won't ask you to raise your hand. If you do, it'll be another one of those outing moments. But I just, preached on this somewhere. And I used the story of Thomas, doubting Thomas, when Jesus rose from the dead and, Thomas wasn't where he was supposed to be. You know this story? Wasn't where he was supposed to be. Jesus comes back, Thomas misses him. And then they say, nah. We saw Jesus and you weren't here. And Thomas says, no, I'm not believing that until I see Jesus, right? And there's a lot in preaching. Thomas gets a lot of flack for doubting. I don't personally think anything's wrong with doubting. I think God can handle a little doubt. But the point is, whether Thomas doubted or not was irrelevant, because it had absolutely no impact on the fact that Jesus was up. So if Thomas had never believed it, it wouldn't have changed a thing about the resurrection. It's the same thing with climate. We're in trouble whether we believe it or not. And will have absolutely no impact on our environment that we keep saying is not true. The United Church of Christ, we just commissioned a new report. We're having some experts look at the number of EPA regulations that have been rolled back in this administration. And we're planning to release that in 2020. It's horrifying. I don't know, you probably do, because most of you have probably been UCC longer than me, that the United Church of Christ is the denomination that coined the phrase environmental racism. We did our first environmental justice report in 1987, and it is still cited today. As a matter of fact, I was talking with Senator Warren's people about environmental justice, and I said to them, the United Church of Christ was the first to coin environmental racism with our toxic waste and racism report, and then their policy people called me back and said, can we have a copy of that report? And I sent them a copy of the report, and if you go and look at Elizabeth Warren's platform for environmental justice, the very first sentence says, the United Church of Christ coined environmental justice in 1987, right? And so we have to have these conversations, and we are working avidly on it. Jim Antal is from around these parts, isn't he? He has been donned as our ambassador of creation justice because he's a pit bull, and he speaks on our behalf, as well as our environmental justice minister, Brooks Brent, who is very good. We have both of them speaking as our face of environmental justice, creation justice, and we are in this to make noise and to win because our children's lives depend on it.
Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Following on Peter's question, the Bible gets misquoted and misused for a lot of purposes to serve various ends. You know, one of them is the part in Genesis about dominion over the earth, and you know, and also I'm thinking there's some parallels to the dominion over oppressed peoples and peoples of color, and I don't know if you can kind of talk about that and kind of the connection and maybe how we might get the Bible right on those topics.
I'm not talking from a scholar perspective because I can't give you the Hebrew words or the addresses right now. Perhaps someone else in here can, and I will not be at all embarrassed by that at all. But I understand Genesis talking about dominion as stewardship, and stewardship is living well with and not power over. And when you define it as power over, to say that you have control over all of those things, it would imply to me that if you have control over something, you just don't have control to destroy it, but you would have control to resurrect it or to bring it back. And where we are going with climate is not something we're going to be able to reverse if we keep going. We have been at least 80%, I want to say 90% dependent upon fossil fuels for 100 years. We cannot continue. And I'm really wrestling, if I can be transparent about it, I'm really wrestling because I believe that seriously, and yet I'm on 4 planes a week. Talk about a conflict. I don't go places where I can bike. And so just looking at my own life, how can I minimize the footprints that I'm making? I'm just one person, but that's a lot. You know, you are my second, this is Tuesday, you're my second flight. And before I hit Friday, I will have had 3 more. And then home. And we have become so accustomed to the luxuries of life that we don't want to make any changes. Right? Do you guys use disposable things here, or do you all do China? You know, I'm still having this battle in my own church. You know, nobody wants to wash the dishes. Recycling, yeah. What did you say? You should have kept the China. Yeah. Yeah. See, look, we have an advocate right here. And those are little things, but little things mean big things. they add up. And so as we look out there, we also have to look in here. Your national setting is completely plastic and foam free at this point. But we're in trouble. Yes, sir.
I want to say thank you, Tracy. I sat at breakfast with you when you were here before you had to scoot out.
Mm-hmm.
And a couple months later, we went down to Mother Emanuel Church in Charleston
Mm-hmm.
and had a chance to sort of get to know people a little bit afterwards. And one of the men stood there. My story of thanks to you is you started communicating and it continued and kept my ears open.
Great.
He said his family were the original family of slaves that started that church.
Wow.
And he was one of the ushers greeting us out on the street. Like you're talking about racial things that in white Wenham, where we are, or white Hamilton right next door, there's not a lot of people of color. There's not a lot of language differences. There's not a lot of difference. And it's hard to talk. I want to thank you for it. And then I wanted to ask you a question, and that is I was looking on the internet today, and you were very involved in mentioning Chicago and for giving a whole lot of money. And I don't know if you care to talk about it, but the article didn't say how you did it. It was fascinating. $5 million if I was listening.
Yes. I will talk about it because Mike says I can talk about it. I asked him. So I'll tell you the story. I'm a storyteller, so when you get ready to go home, just say, that's enough. Last Thanksgiving, I was reading the New York Times because I have to read to stay up to date. And there were these two elderly, silver-haired, little bent-over white ladies that were smiling on this picture in the New York Times. And they had had a luncheon of their closest friends in New York as a fundraiser. And they raised $12,000. And looking at them on the picture, you would have thought that they raised millions of dollars or they did something, I don't know. So it just caught my attention, so I read this story. And they had taken that $12,000 that they raised at the fundraiser. They had partnered with this foundation called RIP Medical Debt, which was started in 2014 in New York, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. And the article said that they gave this foundation this $12,000, and the foundation used the money to purchase medical debt in New York and forgive it. And they were able, with this $12,000, to purchase $1.5 million in debt. I didn't believe it. So I started researching this foundation. To my knowledge, it's the only one like it in the U.S. It was started by two debt collectors who had a Damascus Road experience. Or either they made enough money and I don't know which one is true. But they closed their individual businesses and they started this foundation. And they have a benefactor that pays their overhead and pays their salaries. And they use their debt collector license to continue to purchase medical debt in bundles. Debt collectors purchase medical debt for pennies on the dollar. And so now, instead of purchasing it and then putting people into collections and squeezing them for the money, they simply abolish the debt. They don't do it for everyone. They only do it for people who have no reasonable expectation of ever being able to get out of debt on their own. So it is targeted towards people who live at or below poverty. When I read this, I started following them for 8 months because I'm just skeptical. And I wanted to make sure it wasn't a scam. And I'd seen other churches doing it, but not a denomination, and quite frankly, it was mostly mega churches who could take one collection and get however much money they needed. So I began talking with this company and saying, I want to do this. And General Synod this year was in Milwaukee. I had taken money and put it aside out of my discretionary fund as your executive minister of justice and witness, because I wanted our imprint in Milwaukee to be that we had forgiven debt from the justice side. And I was planning with them and scheming with them to do this for our June Synod. Well, in November, I got a call from Darby, who's my contact at RIP, and she said, I've got good news and bad news. And I said, give me the bad news first. And she said, the bad news is you can't forgive debt in Milwaukee. And I said, why? She said, well, that's the good news. A family foundation purchased all of the available debt in the state of Wisconsin for Thanksgiving. So it ruins your flash. But they're out of debt. So I still had this money that I had set aside, and Chicago is the choir that came to our synod. Trinity Chicago is the choir that came to our synod to do our fundraiser for Synod. I started thinking about them because of the high gun rate violence and because of the poverty I knew was in Chicago. And so I contacted Trinity UCC, which is one of our larger churches. It's the church Jeremiah Wright used to pastor, and now it's Otis Moss. And I told him about this program. Now, you must know that I'm also doing this same program as a pastor in my church, which I started in January because this is my 10th year as pastor, and people, and I just hate when they surprise you with those plastic flowers and try to get you to sit on the side. So I said, please don't do anything for my anniversary. I want us to walk together for a year in Jubilee. And I pastor a poor church. And so I said, we're going to live out the story of 2 fish and 5 loaves of bread. And if you will trust me and just bring whatever you've thrown in the bottom of your purse, whatever you've thrown in the bottom of your pocket, we'll take an extra offering every Sunday called a Jubilee offering, and we're going to use that money and we're going to buy debt in our neighborhood. And nobody thought we could do it. And now we have a target of $12,000. This is October, and we're at $10,800. We're going to make it, right? And everyone, the church is being transformed by it, actually. I only see about 60 people, and yet we're doing this, right? And so I still had this money, and it just would not look good for me to use my national money to do my own church, right? Can't do that. So we said Chicago. And Dr. Moss said, well, that's fine. We'll send you a check and we'll get it done. And I said, no, I really want you to reach out to other UCC churches. I need to call the conference because it means more if we do it together. And so he called some more churches. And what we needed, I had already looked up the zip code in his area. I'd already talked to RIP. They will tell you how much debt is available. I knew there was $2.6 million available in his zip code, and we needed $26,000 to do it. So I only needed them to come up with $11,000. I put in $15,000, but when he started telling people, it took off like wildfire. And those few churches raised $38,000. So we had more than we needed for that zip code. We took another zip code map that gave us income indexes. And we chose zip codes where people were obviously living very low. We did a lot of Inglewood. The median family income in Inglewood is $22,000. Imagine having to live off of $22,000 a year. And so we chose that zip code and another zip code. And we sent the money to RIP, and RIP made our debt purchase. That's important because we are a 501c3. We are a church. We don't pay people's bills individually as the national office. But we can donate to a foundation. The foundation gave no money to the people. The foundation bought the debt, and instead of using the debt to get money, simply canceled the debt. Our $38,000 canceled $5.3 million in debt. Now, the wonderful thing about it is that each of those families, 5,888 families, had their debt abolished. And each of those families will receive a letter. The letters went out Saturday, so they should have them by now, actually, in a yellow envelope with the United Church of Christ logo on the outside, with all the legal jargon of the RIP, saying this is an official document to notify you. It tells them the account numbers, it tells them the debtor, it tells them how much money was forgiven on their behalf. And we were able to put in those letters the national setting, the conference, every church that participated is listed in that letter as being responsible for the forgiveness. And at the end of the letter, there's a paragraph that says, "You may never enter the doors of our church, but we are the United Church of Christ, and we love you. More importantly, you are beloved by God. No matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here, and your debt has been forgiven." That's what you've been seeing on the news. So now, now the church, we are going to take it national. So our Giving Tuesday this year, December 3rd, is Giving Tuesday for everyone. All the funds donated to the United Church of Christ will be used to forgive debt. And what we want to do is invite conferences and churches to join us in this journey. And some churches have already been calling. I took a call today of a church, you will not believe this, a church smaller than mine in St. Louis that said, "How could you do this in Chicago? You didn't do it in St. Louis." And they said, "We have $17,000. We've already voted. We want to do this." That'll be our next purchase. And Christ the King, which is the church I pastor, will probably finish our money early so we can go with them and make a United Church of Christ commitment in St. Louis. There will be other churches who want to do this. Massachusetts, Kent Salati has already called and said their council is meeting and they want to buy medical debt. For our churches and conferences that are small, and perhaps, because let me say this, it has to be a purchase of $15,000 or more because it's not worth RIP's time to do 2,000 here. You can donate to them, but to have some kind of control over the letters and all of that, it has to be 15,000. And so what we want to do is raise money on Giving Tuesday so that we have money to help our churches and our conferences who want to engage in this, to give a dollar for dollar match, to say if you raised $15,000 and you need more money to wipe out your debt, that the national setting will contribute to your effort. We plan to take this through 2020, the election year, all the way to Senate. And we are hoping that in every region of the United Church of Christ, we will have forgiven debt. It's an exciting thing, but it is the Samaritan on the road. And that has been a part of the narrative that I am speaking. It does not fix the road. It picks up the Samaritans. But because we are a justice denomination, I am launching this to have the other conversation. Because it sounds really good when I say we took $38,000 and we abolished $5.3 million of debt. Let's look at the underbelly of that. That means for every dollar that we contributed, we were able to abolish approximately $142. For every $1 that we contributed, we were able to abolish approximately $142. The average amount of debt that was holding people hostage on our list, the average, of course there were some outliers, but the average was $907. which means for about $7, we were able to release them from debt that was ruining their credit, that some people were losing their homes, that people weren't going to the hospital to get the care they needed because they didn't want to incur any more debt. It is unconscionable that debt can be purchased that way and that healthcare has gotten out of control. I'm a nurse. I don't practice anymore. But when I left the hospital, I already knew that you could go to the corner drugstore. You can go to the corner drugstore tonight and buy a bottle of Tylenol for $5 and some change. If you go in the hospital and you get one Tylenol tablet, it is $15. You can go to the grocery store. Your prices may be a little higher here than St. Louis. But you can go to the grocery store and buy a pack of disposable gloves. How many of you use disposable gloves? I clean my house with disposable gloves. So I'm non-sterile disposable gloves, right? You can go to the grocery store and you can buy non-sterile disposable gloves in the dishwashing aisle, 2 pair in a pack for about $2 and something. 1 pair of non-sterile disposable gloves in the hospital is $53. The hospital is, if you go to a 5-star restaurant, they may not have the menu prices on the menu, but you can ask them how much stuff costs. If you go to a department store, you make a decision whether or not you're gonna buy some Louis Vuittons or some Payless, right? You control your money. When you buy a house, you know how much the house is gonna cost. But when you go in the hospital, you don't know any cost until you get the bill. And it's not like you cannot make the bill. If you're sick, you need the help. It is unconscionable that people are making millions and millions of dollars on the back of sick people. And healthcare debt is the highest reason for bankruptcy in the United States. So it's a political reason we're doing it too. To make a commentary. Yes, we're glad the church can do this, but the church shouldn't have to do it. Not like this. And the politicians that we elect, I don't care if they are from the red party, the blue party, the purple party, or the green party. They need to make a commitment to fix the roads. Fix the roads. So that's what we're doing. And we invite you, if you like, to join us. It will be a statement from the United Church of Christ. And it is not out of sync with who we are historically. This is what we do. We lift up justice issues, and we tackle them, and we confront the injustice even inside of our own selves, and we try to make a difference. Yes?
If we're supposed to lead with love and God, how do you explain the evangelical movement today in politics?
I don't. I don't. You know, we all have interpretations, but there's no way you can get where some have gotten and be a follower of Jesus. You can't. You can't. I want to tell you about some other things we're doing that might interest you. We recently received a grant to begin looking at the opioid crisis in the U.S. We have a generous donor that gave us $100,000 to begin putting together materials, curricula, opportunities to teach churches how to identify opioid addiction in our midst and how to address it without judgment and with open arms for the purpose of healing. So we just received that grant this year. We just hired a part-time person to help us facilitate that. We will be doing a campaign to raise more money for the opioid addiction program that we hope to be able to roll out at the United Church of Christ. I told you about the creation justice, and in racial justice, we have released our new curriculum, which is Sacred Conversations, not on race, but Sacred Conversations to End Racism, which includes a all-church book study every 3 quarters, where we read books that deal with racism from various aspects. I can't remember what the next book is, but it's really neat. And go look at it on the website, because what's interesting about our racial justice minister, she is a professor as well as a minister, so she teaches like a professor teaches. And one of the things with these book clubs is for many of the books that we're reading, she's already has agreements with authors to come on the website when we discuss the book and be there to discuss the book as well. So we're working on those aspects with that. The other thing we're working on is our first encounter witness for 1620 for the Mayflower commemorations. There will be a witness from the United Church of Christ. We have a working team working on that together and wrestling with that together. And we're choosing to wrestle on that working team with members of the United Church of Christ who are First Peoples, who are indigenous, and also with people who are non-white, who have been impacted, as well as people who have great pride, not in the atrocities, but pride in their family history of having come over on the Mayflower. If we can't figure it out among ourselves, then we're going to have trouble doing it with the whole denomination, so we're working on that as well. Those are the major things. I think I told you we relaunched Pilgrim Press. Did I talk about that last time I was here? Look, I got a smile. Pilgrim Press is the oldest publishing house in North America. It belongs to the United Church of Christ, and we've never let it go, but it has gone a little dormant because we didn't have the money for a publications team. And as things progressed, we went down to about 1 book a year, 2 books a year. We lost many of our authors. Last year, I brought that back and hired a managing editor. We are anticipating in 2021, which will be our first year going full-fledged, we'll release 10 books. We already have authors for that. We had a little problem because the name of it was Pilgrim Press. And I'll give you a moment of vulnerability. I was so excited and looking for authors from every genre. We needed an indigenous author. We wanted an indigenous author in our first run. And I was at Minnesota's conference, and there was a man there who had written a book on the doctrine of discovery. He was indeed one of our indigenous members. I got so excited, and I said, "Will you write for Pilgrim Press?" Exactly. He said, "You want me to write for Pilgrim Press?" I said, "Okay, this is not my shining moment. I apologize, but I needed this to happen so that I could hear, because sometimes we can't hear." And I took it back to the national setting and said, you know, I know Mike preached a little bit about this Sunday, the Anns. We are the denomination that went out in the street and protested because we don't like the Redskins. And we have Pilgrim Press. And we talked about it. And we talked about how Pilgrim Press is the name that we've had for 200 years, and how there's a lot attached to that name, and how if we changed it to another name, we'd shoot our whole effort in the foot. And so we brought in someone to help us think through that, and we found a solution. So we are still Pilgrim Press, but we changed from Pilgrim with a large P to Pilgrim with a small p. We went from Pilgrim the Colonizer to Pilgrim the Wanderer. And the logo has now changed from the ship to a book with a compass over it. And we are excited about this next iteration of what Pilgrim Press will be. I think I've talked enough. Do you have questions? Yes.
I love how you talked about social justice, and I want to have you talk a little bit more about immigration. I've handled a couple of immigration cases as a lawyer, and I struggle. Not only as a Sunday school teacher, I feel like I'm living a dichotomy, and as a lawyer with what the political climate is right now. And I see the church as a sanctuary, and I'm wondering if you envision or you can see any other ways we can take the church or the UCC to helping these precious people that are just, they're heartbreaking cases. And I feel stymied in the law, and I'm hoping that the church can take off where the law we're just stopped. There's only so much we can do.
So there are several churches in the United Church of Christ who are already acting as sanctuary churches, and we have a campaign to get more. At the last Synod, we were declared a sanctuary denomination. We're very outspoken about that. We have an immigration officer. As a matter of fact, he called me this week trying to get me to come to D.C. to get arrested. I didn't go. Huh? We're glad you're here. Yeah, well, the thing is, I've been arrested 3 times in D.C. And so the last time that I got arrested, they told me that I was going to have to stay a while. And I'm willing to stay, but I want it to be a good one, when I have to stay. So we are working on it. Even this church that I said wants to give the $17,000, they've had a man named Alex living in the church for the last 2 years. 2 years is too long. So we are using our advocacy office in D.C. To pressure our congressmen and our representatives up there. We're doing everything we can. We go to the border often, and I'm glad that you're there standing on the side of what is right, and I know it's difficult, which makes 2020 even more important, right? I don't suffer under any illusions. There's another sermon I preach about David and Goliath. You all know that story? Isn't it funny how everybody always wants to be David? No one ever says they're Goliath. And I talk about that. And I talk about how much emphasis we're giving to Goliath, right? And there's one verse in that story that sticks with me that we rarely preach about, and it says he came out from among the Philistines. It's describing Goliath, right? So this notion that if we change presidents, that we've changed policies is a false one. We have a lot of work to do, and we're going to have to do it after 2020.
That's where I want to go, because I think people focus so much on the political climate, but it's the underbelly. Yes, that we have to change.
Yes.
And I just want to know. I'm hoping that the church can take off where, like, I feel I can't as a lawyer.
Well, and we're in strange times. I know there are other preachers here. I would love for us to talk about that. We're in strange times because most of the people, no matter where you are on whatever side you're on, everybody's sitting in somebody's church.
Right.
So what are we preaching? What are we teaching? How are we convicting and not just comforting? I believe that what's going to change this world is a theological revolution. I believe that. But I'm glad you are where you are, because our babies still need what they need. And it doesn't even appear yet the number of sexual abuse cases that are going to come out of this. Yeah. I saw another hand. Yes. Hi.
So we talked earlier, I spend a lot of time talking with students. It's one of my passions. And I'm really impressed on how a small conversation can change someone's direction.
Yes.
And so my question for you is, how do we as a community come together to facilitate conversations among ourselves, not just so that we have those conversations, but so that we can act and move forward as a community?
Yes. So, around race or around anything?
I think it's anything. So I'm starting to see that it's almost anything, but we can talk about race.
Okay. I'll be transparent about my own journey. I was raised in Birmingham, Alabama, in a very conservative home. And my grandfather was my first pastor, and he was a very conservative pastor. I was raised in a church where women cannot be preachers. If there is a glimpse from the afterlife, I hope that he is tickled and not rolling over. There were 7 grandsons and 2 granddaughters, and all 7 of those sons had hands laid on them that they would preach, and neither of the girls did, and none of the boys preach, and both of the girls do. So maybe there's something about those hands. But I say that to say, I was raised in an environment that taught me being gay was a sin, and not in a big sin. I mean, we had categories, you know. And I grew up with that. And as an adult, even though I don't hate people, I still had that in me because that is the way I was raised. And all the preaching and all the teaching that I received as a child, that's what it was. It wasn't until I started to have genuine, authentic relationships with same-gender loving people that thinking was challenged. It was out of those relationships that I learned that this could not possibly be true. This could not possibly be right. And why do I bring that up in here? Because I don't believe that things change because you have meetings together or that you spend time discussing subjects together. That is too intellectual. You have to form real relationships with people that are different than you. And then what began to happen is when I would hear some off-color remark or some joke or some negative disparagement of people who are same-gender loving, in my mind I would see that person that I cared about. And it was an automatic contradiction to that kind of thinking. And it changed me. And I know that what I was taught was wrong. And I know that what I was taught was limiting the spans of God. And I can understand, even in Scripture, that as difficult as it is for some people to find me as a preacher there, I know that I'm there, and I know that everyone else is too. So if you really want to have a change in what is happening in this church, if you're talking about this church, or in other environments that you're in, it has to be based on relationships. You have to do more than worship together. You have to commune together. And the thing I most often say now is the only place it matters how many colors you have in a place is at Crayola. I'm not just my skin. I'm a person. And when we get to know one another, we find out that we are more alike than we are differently. So I'm not going to ask you to take this quiz, but I'm going to ask you some questions. I ask you to think about them. When you look around your congregation, and you may know the names of people who look differently than you, you may know their kids, you may know or notice when they're in church or not in church. But what do you really know about them? Have you ever shared a meal together? Have you ever been to one another's homes? What do you really know about them? And we live in such a superficial world. And social media has made it worse. You will not believe. I post a lot on social media. It's my 3rd job. And it pays off for me. But if I go to Boston Airport tomorrow and I put on my Facebook page, my flight is canceled, 3 or 4 people are going to reach out to me and say, I'll come pick you up. You can stay at my house. Because they think they know me. But they don't. And I don't know them. And it's wonderful, but you don't know me. And I don't know you. So we can come to church every week and you feel like you know somebody, right? But here's the thing about me, and I don't talk about it that much socially. If you don't know my children, you don't really know me. If you don't know the things that I care about, you really don't know me. So where we start in our congregations, and that's not always skin color. There are other differences, right? It's not just skin color. There are other differences. You have to do things together to build relationship. There's a UCC church in Cleveland. It's a multiracial church. It had the blessing of the church burning down. And it was a gift because then they had to rebuild a church together, right? And so all these people got to know each other differently. And once a year, they have something that I think is phenomenal, but I haven't pushed it yet. It's called Servolution. Servolution. The church commits to 600 hours of volunteer service. And the first couple of years, they did it just themselves. And they would have all these different opportunities to serve in the community. They'd have it up on a board, and only 10 people could sign up for a thing. And so it forced them to work with people who were different than the people that they normally were with all the time. And they got to know each other at these things. And then they would come back and all have a meal together. Now they don't just do it with their church, they do it with other churches as well. And each church can only have 2 or 3 people sign up for each project so that the church members are integrated. And they serve, they do work together. And then they come back and they eat together. That's a place to start. But if you only see each other at church, you don't really know each other. Not for real. Is that fair? What time is it? What time is this over? Oh, it's over!
Thank you, Tracy. She's got to catch a flight tomorrow morning, so it is over. But two things I want to just mention. This guy walking around with the microphone and the white sweater, and his phone ringing, it was because he was taping this. Tom Bentley is going to be leading a discussion on Sunday following worship, this Sunday following worship. So it's an opportunity for us to talk more about this and also to get to know each other a little bit better. And I also just want to mention that all of this is to celebrate our 375th year as a church. We've looked at some of the things we've done that we've been proud of and some of the things that have caused us pain. And we are going to be celebrating that on November 3rd. All of you are welcome. You're always welcome here, whether you come to this church or not. But we're having a special service there to acknowledge our 375 years. And then we're having a luncheon afterwards. It's free. You can come and you can sit together and you can ask about your children and your families and your lives and get to know each other. And so you're right on. On the way up here, we were talking about our children and getting to know each other, and that's really what it's all about. It's about the connections that we have, and it begins with the connections that we have with one another, with the bond that we have with our God, the questions that we ask, the doubts that we have. But then it also moves us toward making a difference in the world in which we live. And thank you for challenging us on that, for encouraging us to continue, and God's blessings on you and the work you're doing, and Godspeed. Thank you.